In 1973, CIA Director Richard Helms ordered the destruction of every file connected to a program that had been running for 22 years. Thousands of documents were shredded. The operation was so thorough, so deliberate, that investigators, who later tried to piece together what had happened, compared it to trying to reconstruct a book from the ash of a fire. But Helms missed something. A batch of around 20,000 documents had been misfiled in a financial records building not covered by the destruction order. They survived. In 1977, they were discovered during a Freedom of Information Act request, and what they revealed forced the United States government to acknowledge one of the most disturbing programs any democratic government had ever run against its own people. The program was called MKUltra. It was not a conspiracy theory. It was not speculation. Every detail that follows comes from the CIA's own documents, from congressional testimony, and from the sworn accounts of survivors. MKUltra was born from fear. In the early 1950s, the United States intelligence community was convinced that the Soviet Union and China had developed techniques for controlling the human mind. The belief was not entirely without basis. During the Korean War, American prisoners of war had appeared in propaganda films, making statements that seemed impossible to explain by ordinary coercion alone. At show trials in Eastern Europe, veteran communist officials confessed in elaborate, convincing detail to crimes they almost certainly had not committed. Something was being done to people's minds. The question consuming the CIA was what exactly and how to replicate it. On April 13, 1953, CIA Director Allen Dulles officially authorized Project MKUltra. Its stated objective was the development of a capability in the covert use of biological and chemical materials. What that clinical phrase meant in practice was this. The CIA wanted to know whether it was possible to control a human being's thoughts, memories, behavior, and identity using drugs, hypnosis, sensory deprivation, psychological torture, or any combination of the above. The man placed in charge of the program was a chemist named Sidney Gottlieb. Gottlieb was a genuinely brilliant scientist with a clubfoot, a stutter, and a personal interest in folk dancing that colleagues found endearing. He was also, by any reasonable assessment of his career, one of the most prolific and systematic human experimenters since the trials at Nuremberg. MKUltra operated through at least 80 institutions, universities, hospitals, prisons, military bases. Many of them received CIA funding through front organizations and shell foundations, specifically created to obscure the source of the money. Researchers at these institutions often did not know they were working for the CIA. Some did know. Some were enthusiastic participants. The experiments covered an enormous range of methods, all aimed at the same core question. What breaks a human mind, and what fills the space left behind? LSD was the drug the program returned to most obsessively. Gottlieb believed LSD might be the key to unlocking a state of total mental vulnerability, a condition in which a subject could be reprogrammed, their existing identity dissolved and replaced. The CIA obtained virtually the entire world supply of LSD from the Swiss pharmaceutical company Sandoz in 1953, purchasing 10 kilograms, enough for roughly 100 million doses. What followed was one of the most extensive and uncontrolled drug experiments in the history of medicine. CIA personnel dosed each other at parties, watching for reactions, reporting on colleagues without those colleagues' knowledge or consent. They dosed mental patients in hospitals, some of whom were given LSD every day for weeks or months without ever being told what they were receiving. They dosed prisoners, including inmates at the federal penitentiary in Atlanta and at the California Medical Facility, offering reduced sentences in exchange for participation in experiments that the prisoners were not given accurate information about. In an operation with the darkly unremarkable name Operation Midnight Climax, the CIA set up safe houses in San Francisco and New York where prostitutes, working on the CIA's payroll, brought clients back to apartments fitted with one-way mirrors. The clients were dosed with LSD without their knowledge. CIA officers watched from behind the mirrors, taking notes. The program ran for nearly a decade. The most notorious single incident of MKUltra involved a man named Frank Olson. Olson was a United States Army biochemist who worked at Fort Detrick in Maryland on the Army's biological weapons research program. He was also connected to MKUltra through his work with Gottlieb's division. In November 1952, Olson attended a CIA retreat at a cabin in Maryland. During the retreat, Gottlieb secretly dosed the drinks of several attendees with LSD, telling them only 20 minutes afterward what had happened. Olson's reaction was severe. In the days that followed, colleagues described him as deeply disturbed, paranoid, and profoundly changed from his normal self. 9 days after the retreat, Frank Olson fell from the 10th floor of the Statler Hotel in New York City and died on the pavement below. The CIA's internal account was that Olson had jumped from the window in a psychotic episode triggered by the LSD. For 2 decades, Olson's family was told he had died of a fall. They were not told about the LSD. They were not told about MKUltra. His death was ruled a suicide. In 1994, 42 years after Olson's death, his son Eric had the body exhumed. A forensic examination found evidence of blunt force trauma to the head that predated the fall. A forensic scientist who examined the remains stated that the evidence was more consistent with Olson having been rendered unconscious and then thrown from the window than with a voluntary jump. No one has ever been charged with Frank Olson's death. The Olson family received a presidential apology in 1975 and a financial settlement. The settlement came with no admission of what had actually happened. LSD was only one instrument in the program. MKUltra subprojects, of which there were at least 150, explored methods that went considerably further. Canadian psychiatrist Ewen, working at the Allen Memorial Institute in Montreal, received CIA funding through a front organization called the Society for the Investigation of Human Ecology. Cameron believed that mental illness could be treated by erasing a patient's existing personality and rebuilding it from nothing. His method was called psychic driving. Patients admitted to Cameron's care, many of them seeking treatment for relatively minor conditions, including anxiety and depression, were subjected to drug-induced sleep for weeks or months at a time, kept unconscious for up to 65 days continuously. While unconscious, they were played recorded messages on loop through helmets fitted with speakers, sometimes for 16 hours a day. Cameron called this depatterning. He was attempting to overwrite his patients' minds like a cassette tape. The results were catastrophic. Survivors of Cameron's program described returning to consciousness with their memories destroyed. Adults who had been admitted to his clinic as functioning people with careers, families, and full lives emerged unable to remember their own names, unable to recognize their spouses, unable to recall their children, reduced to states of profound and often permanent psychological damage. Some had to be retrained in basic functions. Some never recovered. Cameron's work was funded by the CIA from 1957 to 1964. He received approximately $60,000 over that period. He died in 1967 without facing any formal consequences for what he had done to his patients. In 1988, the Canadian government paid out $80,000 each to a group of Cameron's surviving victims in compensation. The settlements came without admission of wrongdoing, beyond drugs and psychological destruction. MKUltra explored electroconvulsive therapy administered at multiples of the standard clinical dose, sensory deprivation using isolation tanks, hypnosis, radiation, and the effects of combining multiple methods simultaneously. There were experiments on children. Declassified documents reference research into the effects of various substances and techniques on subjects across a wide age range. The full scope of what was done to minors within the program has never been definitively established because of the 1973 document destruction. There were also deaths beyond Olson. The precise number of people who died as a direct result of MKUltra experimentation is not known and will likely never be known. The destroyed records took those figures with them. The program began to unravel in 1973. By then, the CIA had been operating MKUltra for 20 years with minimal congressional oversight and virtually no external accountability. The context was changing. Watergate had destroyed the public's trust in government institutions. Internal CIA investigations were circling closer to programs that had never been designed to withstand scrutiny. Gottlieb requested the destruction of the MKUltra files. Helms authorized it. The shredding began. What Gottlieb and Helms did not know was about the misfiled documents in the Financial Records Building. Those 20,000 pages survived. In 1975, the Church Committee, a Senate committee investigating the intelligence community's abuses, began asking questions about CIA programs. The agency admitted that MKUltra had existed, but claimed most records were gone. In 1977, the surviving documents were found and turned over to the Senate. A second wave of hearings followed. Senator Edward Kennedy, who chaired the hearings, said at the time that the deputy director of the CIA had revealed that over 30 universities and institutions were involved in an extensive testing and experimentation program, which included covert drug tests on unwitting citizens at all social levels, high and low, Native Americans and foreign. Several of these tests involved the administration of LSD to unwitting subjects in social situations. The CIA's director at the time, Admiral Stansfield Turner, testified before Congress and acknowledged that the program had been fundamentally inconsistent with the principles and ideals of the United States. No one was prosecuted. Gottlieb retired in 1973, moved to a farm in Virginia, tended goats, and later volunteered as a doctor in India. He died in 1999, 6 days after the federal government filed a motion to depose him in a lawsuit brought by surviving victims. The survivors and their descendants have spent decades attempting to get full accountability for what was done. Several Canadian victims of Ewen Cameron's program filed a class action lawsuit against the CIA and the Canadian government. The CIA settled out of court. The Canadian government's settlement in 1988 covered only a fraction of the known victims. In the United States, a handful of victims and their families won civil suits. Most faced the fundamental obstacle of trying to prove specific harm from programs specifically designed to leave no trace and whose records had been deliberately destroyed. The question of what MKUltra actually achieved, whether any of its objectives were reached, whether the CIA ever found a reliable method of controlling a human mind, was never fully answered in the public record. What the surviving documents show is that the program produced enormous suffering, generated results that were scientifically unreliable by any professional standard, and was driven by a combination of Cold War paranoia, institutional arrogance, and a complete absence of ethical constraint. The buildings where many of the experiments took place still stand. The University of Illinois, McGill University, Columbia University, Stanford Research Institute. The buildings have different names now, serve different purposes, house different laboratories. The Allen Memorial Institute in Montreal, where Ewen Cameron destroyed his patients' minds with CIA money, is still a functioning psychiatric facility. Sidney Gottlieb's farm in Virginia was sold after his death. The new owners found nothing unusual about the land. Frank Olson's grave is in Frederick, Maryland. His son Eric has spent more than 30 years trying to get the United States government to acknowledge on the record exactly how his father died. As of this writing, no one has ever faced criminal charges for anything that happened inside MKUltra. The documents that survived the shredding are available through the CIA's online reading room. Anyone can read them